should be. Oh, it's not saying that it's recording. Oh, there we go. Okay. Okay. Okay, so we'll get started. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you very much. I'm very excited about today's session, which is all about haunting, memory, trauma, culture. And this is part of our Writing Cultures research group, which is within the ARC school. So part of, wider humanities commitment to research. And what I think is really important that we've been thinking quite a bit about, in our own university, is the importance of historical thinking to the humanities for context, for resources, for inspiration, and for flights of the imagination as well. So I thank you both for bringing this kind of historical perspective. Both of you come to from different directions as well. So our two guest speakers today, first is Guðrún Guðmundsdóttir, the professor of comparative literature at University of Iceland, where she founded the Center for the Studies of Memory and Literature. Her research interests include life writing, memory studies, and contemporary literature. She's published widely on these issues, including her book Borderlines, Autobiography and Fiction, Postmodern and Life Writing in 2003, Representations of Forgetting in Life Writing and Fiction in 2017, and her most recent work is the edited volume Noir in the North, Genre, Politics, and Place, which just came out last year. Our second speaker today is Lina Kjærvik-Kausar, who is Associate Professor of Cultural Theory at the Institute of Cultural Research, University of Tartu in Estonia. Lina has published widely in life writing studies, personal narratives of Soviet deportations and Gulag within theoretical framework of trauma and the study of diaries and correspondences. In her research within the field of trauma studies in particular, she's argued for the need for a conceptual and methodological framework of trauma that caters for cultural and historical specificity of that experience, modes of mediating and coping with it. Her publications include, very recently in 2020, the Estonian Women's Deportation Diaries, in the collection The Diary, The Epic of Everyday Life from Indiana University Press, Trauma and Life Writing in the Routledge Companion to Literature and Trauma, 2019. And linking to our title for this session, her essay Voicing Trauma and Deportation Narratives of Baltic Women in the collection Haunted Narratives, Life Writing in the Age of Trauma. And in case you don't know me, I'm Meg Jensen, Professor of English Literature and Creative Writing at Kingston. My own special interests are memory, trauma, and its representations in art, literature, music, and public monuments. So we'll start off, I believe, with Gun will beginning her presentation first, and then Lina will, and we'll take questions at the end.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's great to see you or see some of you. Yeah, I'll just start right off. So this is what I'm going to talk about: post-memory dementia and autobiographical writing. Now, Anne Whitehead, in her book, Trauma Fiction, discusses how novelists use diverse methods to reflect traumatic memories in their texts. Novelists have frequently found that the impact of trauma can only be adequately represented by mimicking its forms and symptoms, so that temporality and chronology collapse, and narratives are characterized by repetition and indirection. Another method which can be seen in trauma fiction is the staging or witnessing of another's testimony. Testimony is, of course, of vital importance in any discourse on trauma and narrative. It has a particular status, and the act of listening carries in itself a responsibility to the teller. The narrator in W.G. Sebald's much acclaimed Austerlitz from 2001 listens to another man's testimony and attempts to come to grips with it, to pin it down, and in some sense to take on his burden, as the act of listening can entail. Thus, the transactional character of trauma testimony is underlined. There are other types of significant transactions of trauma and memory. For instance, when traumatic memory is passed down the generations, and this has been the focus of Marianne Hirsch's work and what she terms post-memory. Hirsch has emphasized the role of post-memory in a variety of memory practices, not least in artistic and imaginative ones. She says post-memory's connection to the past is thus actually mediated not by recall, but by imaginative investment, projection, and creation. To grow up with overwhelming inherited memories, to be dominated by narratives that preceded one's birth or one's consciousness, is to risk having one's own life stories displaced, even evacuated by our ancestors. It is to be shaped, however, indirectly by traumatic fragments of events that still defy reconstruction and exceed comprehension. Hirsch, in her analysis of Sebald's works, has explained that it displays what she describes as affiliative post-memory, an intragenerational horizontal identification that makes that child's position more broadly available to other contemporaries, as opposed to familial post-memory, which refers to the literal second generation. The texts that I am concerned with today are Lisa Pignonesi's Losing the Dead, a family memoir from 1999, and Linda Grant's Remind Me Who I Am Again from 1998, and they belong to the latter category of familial post-memory. Two women who write when their mother's memory starts to fail in order to capture the past before it disappears. Both texts have also several connections and references to cultural memory, as among the subjects they have to contend with are the Holocaust and migration. Traumatic experience can be forgotten, or more to the point, we might like to forget traumatic events. As Björn Krondorfer suggests, oblivion, in contrast to the totality of memory, helps the rawness of trauma to take on forms of remembrances that are manageable by survivors and recognizable by secondary witnesses. Again, the importance of form is emphasized, the ordering, the telling, the transmission that will negotiate a new relationship between remembering and forgetting in relation to the traumatic event. Both Pignonesi and Grant have to contend with the oscillation between remembering and forgetting, both in a personal sense and in the culture at large. The time of their writing is no coincidence, at the height of the millennial memory boom, where in Jan Assmann's terms, communicative memory of the Second World War is giving way to cultural memory. His theories on how memory is transformed over time have been very influential. The progress of memory from communicative memory, which comprises memories related to the recent past, and through time, once those who embodied it have died, it gives way to a new memory, cultural memory, which transforms factual into remembered history, thus turning it into myth. Marianne Hirsch, however, believes that this does not account for ruptures introduced by collective historical trauma, by war, Holocaust, exile, and refugeehood. These ruptures would certainly inflect these schemas of transmission, she says. Both embodied communicative memory and institutionalized cultural memory would be severely impaired by traumatic experience. Both texts considered here describe such ruptures, though to a different degree of severity, and the writers are faced with a complex task in trying to reorder and recast events that are difficult to corroborate or verify, but which carry with them profundity and weight, which the writers have inherited, so to speak, and they attempt here to put into narrative form. Lisa Pignonesi writes in Losing the Dead on her attempts to put together her parents' story during the Second World War. She gives a brief summary of the different ways in which the war is used in memory debates across Europe and beyond at the time of her writing, and concludes, in its own small way, my family's story touches on this whole complex tangle of remembering and forgetting. What measure is due to each in the tricky dance of time, which is the making of a life? Her parents were Polish Jews who managed to survive the war and emigrated first to France and then to Canada. Apignanesi is aware of the extreme difficulty she faces in trying to tell the story, but is driven by a strong need, which is not only particular to her, but very much part of her generation and the millennial memory boom. She says, in the shadow of the millennium, it seems we are all preoccupied by memory. To construct a future, we need to unearth new narratives of the pasts which have been buried by repressive regimes, or left to faster, or past transformed by Cold War politics, or simply past relegated to the limbo of latency because they were too painful to think about. As Andreas Huyssen claimed in 1995, this is the time of twilight memories. The obsessions with memory and contemporary culture must be read in terms of this double problematic. Twilight memories are both generational memories on the wane, generational memories on the wane due to the passing of time and the continuing speed of technological modernization, and memories that reflect the twilight status of memory itself. This status of being of the twilight is both an indication of things to come, but also the very time of memory. As he says, twilight is the moment of the day that foreshadows the night of forgetting, but that seems to slow time itself, an in-between state in which the last light of the day may still play out its ultimate marvels. It is memory's privileged time. With her head firmly turned backward in memory's twilight, it is its privileged time, Apignanesi goes in search of her family's past, an endeavor which is fraught with doubts and difficulties. She examines her own memories, her family's, and travels to Poland in search of concrete answers about her family's origins. Unearthing such a difficult and violent past is not without its ethical dimensions, as becomes abundantly clear to her when on a visit to Warsaw, she finds the building the Gestapo used as headquarters during the war and where her father was interrogated and tortured. She says, "Do I want to will this mute stone into speech?" Telling the story is not necessarily what is always right, what is always needed. Sometimes silence is the correct response, especially as regards memories of violence. What prompted Apignanesi's search at this moment in time, however, was her mother's failing memory, a common trope in family memoirs. Apignanesi describes in a preamble to the work with the title Legacies that her mother can only return and return again to what she has already told me, scraps of unruly experience which refuse the consecutive shape of a story. The writer's response is then, of course, to write, to make sense of it all. It is to anchor myself against the rudderless shape of her mind that I finally decide to write all this down. Writing has to entail some kind of order, even if the voyage into the past is always colored by invention. Memory is also a form of negotiation. We see here the familiar metaphor of memory as a body of water or a ship, and the image of a delving into the past as a journey, and the emphasis that memory is not hard and fast fact, but a negotiation with the writing down which is colored by invention. But writing the family's story down is also an attempt at being a better daughter, more dutiful, more responsible, as she would like to give her mother's past to her, intact, clear, with all its births and deaths and missing persons in place, she says. The task I know is impossible, the dead are lost, but maybe, nonetheless, it makes a difference if by remembering them, we lose them properly. Writing down their memories is a form of combating forgetting, raising them a portable monument in Anne Rigney's terms. And while this is certainly one of the aims of the work, Apignanesi is also interested in finding out what happens when memories haunt the descendants of those who experienced the events, what she calls transgenerational haunting. Memory, like history, is uncontrollable. It cascades through the generations in series of misplaced fears, mysterious wounds, odd habits. The child inhabits the texture of these fears and habits without knowing they are memory. It is this unruly experience which she has set herself the task of putting down in orderly narrative for an understanding of how they work, all those traumatic fragments of events that still defy narrative reconstruction and exceed comprehension, in Hirsch's words. But in Apignanesi's terms, writing on memory is still meaningful, as we then can try to lose the dead properly. One of the ways in which memories are transmitted to the next generation is when children overhear a tale not meant for them. For the children, the context is often missing and the stories stand out as fragmented morsels of memory they have to make sense of. Appignanesi describes such a scene when other survivors visited her parents. The worst stories are told obliquely, in hushed voices, usually when the principal subject has left the room. They operated on her, you know, one of their crazy experiments. She can't now, no children. But when the woman with the blue jottings on her arm comes back into the room, she is smiling, and everyone else smiles too. Snippets of conversations, unexplained and perhaps unremarkable at the time, are left in the child's mind, and as with post-memory in general, efforts at understanding comes later. She says, it's only retrospectively that I understood that these stories were poignant, often tragic. But when she was younger, she wanted nothing to do with these stories. She says, I longed to bury the past and its traces. The memory dynamics at work in families come in a variety of constellations. In Linda Grant's text, Remind Me Who I Am Again, she is prompted to write, as Appignanesi was, by her mother's memory loss. Grant's mother suffers from a serious form of dementia. She is of Jewish immigration stock, and Grant finds herself compelled to write before the past disappears completely. He says, I don't know if it is a tragedy or a blessing when Jews who insist on forgiving and forgetting nothing should end their lives remembering nothing. My mother, the last of her generation, was losing her memory. Only the deep past remained, which emerged at moments in bits and pieces. The text is in part a detailed account of her mother's illness and of her two daughters' experience of trying to care for her, at once grappling with the emotional weight of her continuing descent into dementia and with the practical dealings with the UK healthcare system. The other strand of the work recounts the family's past, origin and history, where Grant attempts to reconstruct an elusive past and to understand the stories she inherited from her parents, all made the more difficult by her mother's failing memory. This moment, the one she is really living, is lost from sight as soon as it happens, and the long ago memories are vanishing too. Only fragments remain. She will forget to speak, and one day even her heart will lose its memory and forget to beat, and she will die. Memory, I have come to understand, is everything. It is life itself. This is a common metaphor on a connection between remembering and forgetting. Memory is life, forgetting is death, but there is more to it than that. Of course, we often associate forgetting with negative aspects, such as neglect, carelessness, indifference, but we cannot ignore the fact that forgetting is always part of memory. We need to forget to survive. Forgetting shapes the past in a manner that makes us who we are and makes us capable of telling our story. Tell me what you have forgotten, and I will tell you who you are, the ethnologist Marc Auchier says in his book Le Forme de l'Oubli. In Grant, we see again a writer looking to make sense of the rumors and overheard conversations, the hidden pasts of immigrants who are extremely reluctant to share their histories openly and directly. Grant is constantly confronted with fragments of the past she is left with, pieces of half-told stories, which are there as frustrating but also tantalizing hints to the family's past lives. Her regret is, as in Appignanesi's case above, of not having asked about any of these stories earlier, describing a familiar condition of the young who are utterly uninterested in their parents' memories. She says, when I was younger, I was both stiff with my parents' reminiscences. I had no curiosity. But now with age, it all changes, and a deep-seated need to fill in the gaps of the past makes itself felt. Not only as a familiar or autobiographical responsibility, but also as a cultural responsibility. He says, it is my fate now to scramble among the ruins of my mother's memory in search of my past, of who all of us are. To have grown up as a Jewish daughter into an insistence of the importance of memory, knowing that without it, we are animals. I will leave you to read the quote itself in full. As I mentioned above, this feeling of being left alone to reconstruct a disappearing generation's past was common at the end of the millennium, as Appignanesi puts it. The familiar biological irony of all this doesn't escape me, she says. This is the ultimate generation game. All my friends are playing it. We are suddenly interested in our parents' past, which we feel are linked with our own buried ones. Grant's search for this past is constantly impeded by her particular family background, by the fact that her family was not very truthful in their accounts of the past. They were divided as immigrants between two worlds. As Grant explains of her mother, it was precisely because she was so divided that we were never able to trust what she said in the first place, and so memory in our family was always a tricky business. This is a point she comes back to repeatedly. She says, I grew up in a family where the past was shifting and untrustworthy, where people's memories and what they said they couldn't remember were not necessarily to be trusted. My family had simply reinvented itself for the 20th century and a new land, shedding the past, which like a skin was left to decompose and die. Escaping the fate of their fellow Jews coming to the UK before the Second World War and leaving the past firmly behind has left them with a strong suspicion of authorities, and Grant explains this as the common immigrant experience, whatever their origin. Don't tell anyone our business, they said, not because they were reticent, private people, but because they were only just managing to control the contradictions themselves. The Russian-occupied Poland in which my father was born has not existed for so long that it is now just a collection of documents for historians to study, not a place at all. And if your personal history is inaccessible, is it surprising that all you can engage in is the manufacture of myths? This, of course, also makes her own account untrustworthy. Her attempts at recreating the past are doomed to failure, as the fragments that have survived in the generational memory are of dubious origin. For the second or third generation of immigrants, this loss has become an inherited loss, a post-memory that is characterized by great uncertainties and blank spots in the family's background, which the writer feels compelled to remedy. The problem now is that her mother faces having to invent herself all over once again. As she has no memory of day-to-day occurrences, she attempts to retain a coherent identity and daily history. She says, my mother presents a fictitious person for inspection, hoping it will pass muster. Thus, the loss of memory mirrors the earlier loss of homeland. A new self needs to be invented for a new reality, in this case out of physical necessity rather than out of the constraints of culture in the immigrant's life. Grant explains both the personal and the cultural ramifications memory loss can have. It's like being thrown out to sea. So the whole thing about memory is that it's just not just one member of a family losing their memory, and for the Jewish community it's even more complex, because while all cultures are to do with memory, none more so than the Jewish community, in which everything is about what was. She contemplates how this memory or non-memory will be passed on to the next generation in a description that recalls the transformation of communicative memory into cultural memory. She says, what I know is that as long as I live, I will remember my parents, that the memories I have of them will be transmitted to the next generation, until they erode away into myth, nothing but stories, and when they do, they will exist in another kind of recollection. Some of the problems Grant faces in coming to terms with her mother's dementia point to the importance of memory for our own sense of being, our sense of self and identity. Personality changes are well known in dementia patients, and Grant has to ask herself, but it isn't just about what she can or can't remember, for I have to ask myself, which bit was the illness and which her own real personality? And how could you tell the two apart? She tries to find ways to restore her mother to herself, and while looking for a place for her in a nursing home, she imagines taking her back to Liverpool, where she spent most of her life. She says, here in Liverpool, my mother will also be more herself. She will exist, as she has not done for so many years, in the context of her old friends and her own beginnings. She will be replanted back on the earth she came from, a wandering Jew no more. A sense of place will be restored to her, and with it a sense of self. At the same time, she realizes that this is a utopian vision. Her mother is already lost, and where she is will not change that. Thus, these two texts show that the task of post-memory is trying to make sense of these stories and come to terms with that much has been forgotten through various processes of silences, reinvention, and storytelling. In an afterword, Grant describes that the form she needed for this was life writing. Fiction would not do. She says, I had been struggling for some months to write a novel based on my family. I felt that the fictional characters I was creating were in some bizarre way robbing my relatives of their own biographies. Familial responsibility to their stories means for both Grant and Opinionesi holding on to the referential, the real, in a double move to unearth the forgotten and write it down to prevent it from being forgotten, but also with constant awareness that what is dug up and given narrative form is only partial and provisional, that the true story is not there to be found. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's absolutely fascinating. And we're going to turn over now to Lena, and then, as I said, we'll begin questions after that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll try to share my screen. I don't know if can you see? You can see my screen.
Looks like it's happening.
Okay.
It's loading on it. Yep, there we go.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. Let me see. How do I? Yes. Okay. Yes. Okay. So I just wanted to check how do I move that. So thank you very much, Meg, for inviting me to this seminar, and I feel especially honored because Meg's work on trauma has been very, very influential for me. So I have her book on my desk, and it is just I have, every page is kind of thoroughly underlined and marked with post-its, and I am this is one of the those academic work that have really kind of been life-changing for me. And what has been of special importance for me is that Meg's work is not, it doesn't only, doesn't seek to just, have a discussion in only academic space, but it is it seeks to, to start a discussion or to find new kinds of therapies for those suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. And I know, Meg, that you have also worked kind of directly on those issues in human rights context, and this is what has been of very huge importance for me. Yeah. So thank you. Onto my onto my work, and I'm afraid that my presentation today won't be as kind of, how to say, it won't be as, in a poem, this kind of whole, or won't be as close-knit as the first one was. It is ongoing work, and also I'm not working on literary works, but on life stories, people's life stories and their life writing documents. And I'm trying to present to you a little bit of work, a work in progress that I have been also I've been doing research for this also this year, and interviewing a man who was deported as a child in 1941, and whose mother and sister died of hunger in the deportation location. He's now in his early 90s and still alive. And already as a boy, he recorded these events. He witnessed his mother's death, and he also recorded it. And you can see on the opening slide, this is the folder, the makeshift folder he made. This folder, it's some kind of either some kind of Russian book or a document, and this is the folder for him for all the letters that he received when he was still deported. Yeah, okay, but and my work, I have worked for a long time on these Stalinist mass deportations from the Baltics. And I won't go into detail, but just to give you some idea. So there are these two infamous dates. One is in June 14, 1941, and another one is in March 49. And on the slide, you can see how, the approximate numbers and why people were deported. But those who have historians who have done research on them, this forced dislocation, they say that this is that we just like to think of these two waves, because people were arrested and deported and sent to the gulags all the time, but these are just the two biggest waves. But indeed, Uno Mell and both the two people whom I'm going to talk about today, Erna Nagel and Uno Mell, they were both deported on June 14, 1941. And so this deportation, wave of deportations, it was kind of the purpose from the point of the Soviet authorities was cleansing the society of anti-Soviet elements. So that meant anyone who had, any important role in this independent states. So that included political leadership, government officials, civil servants, businessmen, higher ranks of the military, policemen, prison wardens, and so on. But as for the two people I'm going to talk about, or their stories, they, it is unclear, why they were deported. Okay, and so how can I do research on these kinds of topics? In the kind of during the period of regaining independence, the memory, or how people remembered, what had happened to them and their family members in the past, they started talking about this experience publicly, and there was kind of like a boom of telling life stories. There often this regaining of independence process is referred to in the Baltic states as the singing revolution, and indeed it was a singing revolution. But I always, I'd like to say that we regained independence not only by singing, but also by telling life stories. And this is not, I'm saying it humorously, but it is no joke. But this kind of, how to say, boom of this publicly mediating life experience, this lay the basis of life story archives. And there are extensive life story archives in Estonia, and in the archives of cultural history in the Estonian Literary Museum, now there is a life story archive that consists of approximately 4,000 archival units. That is how we like to put it. Yeah, and there have been also several publications based on these life stories. And on the slide, you can see publications from all three Baltic countries that focus specifically on this deportation experience. But of course, not all of those also, for example, in the Archive of Cultural History, not all of those 4,000 life stories, of course, they don't focus just on deportations, but deportation and Gulag stories, they are important. They are kind of important part of this memory culture, and they testify to this inhuman nature of the Soviet regime, and also they testify to survival. And my interest in researching these life stories, mostly that are in the archives, it has been kind of looking at how people mediate this experience, and also, I think already for quite many years, maybe 15 years or so, I've looked at them within the context of also trauma theory. And this is not, this hasn't been an easy process, because on the one hand, the kind of critical theoretical framework of trauma, it is very strict. Trauma is exactly, it's just that. And, when you have experienced something traumatic, the cure to this is, through mediating this, or attempting to mediate this experience. And it doesn't match the way that Baltic people have mediated their experience. And I have mostly worked on women's narratives. And here you have on the slide, you can see my work on Stalinist repressions and life writing and trauma. And you can see that almost, I think, every publication, it focuses on women's narratives. And also there's a reason for this, because with this mediating of the deportation experience, then of course, like women were more women were deported, and although they lived in very harsh circumstances, still more of them survived than those who were sent to the Gulag, and they came back and then also survived to tell their life story. So through these deportation narratives, women also entered this kind of public arena of memory and history, and kind of gained their own voice. But like this has also been my focus of in really looking at what kind of voice it is, what can you say. And then I noticed that although this experience is often it contains these kinds of aspects that can be considered traumatic, but it is not mediated in this key at all. And then this has been, you know, for many years, this has been basically the kind of the focus of my work, trying to figure out, you know, whether trauma theory is something that should be applied at all, in what context, why are women not talking about this experience as traumatic. But today I will talk about a little bit different on a different topic, and I will talk about something that has started interesting me more recently, on materialities of memory and trauma. And on this photo you can see this old man I told you about, Uno Mell. And here he is in his garden in Lihula in Western Estonia on February 5th this year. And this is a very important date for him, because on this date, when he was 16 years old, he arrived back in Estonia. So he says that this is his second birthday. But you can see he's standing here in front of a cedar tree that he brought the cone of this tree from Siberia when he revisited the place where he was deported and where his mother died of hunger. He brought back a cone and he planted this from the seed, this tree, and it grew into a beautiful, powerful tree. And you know, if you touch the branches, it is very kind of, in Estonia we don't have this kind of spruce trees. It's beautiful, silky, and so he has this memory, this very material memory, kind of with him all the time in his life. So I think his life story, but also the way he has himself documented it, and not only like he's an amateur filmmaker also, but also documented with the way he has lived, also with, you know, planting this tree. It is very good proof of, you know, how memories, kind of about the materialities of memories, and how people go about I don't know, coping with or handling traumatic experience. And Meg has, in her work, she has focused on how people handle traumatic memories by trying, you know, expressive writing, but also in her book she tackles different other kinds of ways, creative ways of coping with experience. And I have, with kind of working with all the, you know, materials of Uno Mell, that he has been absolutely fantastic, kind to share with me, that I have seen kind of how true it is and how resourceful people are, you know, with these kinds of materials of memory. But at the same time, as you know, doing research on him and on other related matters, I also feel, you know, how awkward it is for me, or how clumsy I am. So I remember when, you know, standing there in the yard and taking a photo of him with my, you know, quite new Samsung Galaxy phone, you know, looking at, you know, what angle, you know, and realizing how it is absolutely impossible for me to actually really capture, you know, what was there in front of me, you know, that his life, the way he has survived and made his kind of way through life, and the way he has, tried to capture this memory on all the things that he has done, that I felt that it was also kind of beyond my reach. So for me, one of the aspects of materiality of memory is also the question of what about the researcher, as a researcher, when I'm doing research on materiality of memory, how can I access it, or can I access it at all? And also, in a way, you know, how ethical, you know, it is, are there ethical boundaries about, you know, these kinds of materialities? And there are also other things. When I visited, I spent the whole day with Uno Mell, and there were other things about his life where this materiality of this traumatic losses of his life, they were kind of all around him in his house. And then before, you know, today I have, you know, contemplated for quite a while how much I'm gonna share that, and I decided that I can't, you know, share more. But for me, it was it left really very, very deep experience, impression on me. And I also, again, I realized how it is impossible, absolutely impossible, to really comprehend somebody's life experience as such. But there's, like, on this slide, there's another source that is also like a, how to say, it is material trace of deportation experience. You can see on the left side, you can see this cover of a diary, deportation diary of an Estonian woman as it was published, but she kept it in her deportation location, and she died there in January 1945. But although it is highly unlikely her diary survived, and almost half a century later, it was somehow found its way back to Estonia to her only surviving relative, that was her brother. And so it was also this kind of material trace of a person's existence. And kind of it has one way of existence in the hands of a brother, and then it kind of has a different life when it was published as a diary. But although it is like like now we just have it as a book, I have never seen the manuscript of that diary, but this materiality of memory, again, it is so important there. And I have somehow tried to kind of weave it into my research and to make sense of it. And also on the right, you can see, how to say, a footing from a documentary that was made also to commemorate the June 1941 deportations. And this man, Uno Mell, he's the protagonist of the film, because the whole crew, they go to Siberia to find the grave of his mother. And it is, again, it is about also the materiality of memory, but it's also about the travel of memory. And I've been also trying to kind of to think of, or to jam my research kind of within the framework of the paradigms of traveling memory, because in this way in Estonia, this commemoration of deportation has been established. It ties this commemoration very strongly to national memory and to kind of to Estonia. And if you just kind of think of deportations in very simple practical terms, it meant kind of huge dislocation for the people. They were taken thousands of kilometers away and then spent many years there, and then came back. So that it includes quite a lot of traveling, and also this kind of immense shifts in time, and also in that sense when you experience something and how you remember something and how you mediate this memory. Because during the Soviet times, people could not talk about their deportation experience. When they came back, they were quite stigmatized people. They was very hard for them to find work, and also to protect their families. They did not really talk about their experience to their even to their closest family members. So there's a lot of travel, or a lot of this kind of temporal shifts included in the memory also. But okay, and here you can see the map of Gulag, where the different camps were. You can see how scattered it is in space. Let me see. But in the field of memory studies, there, as I said, there was that was about 10 years ago, or a bit less. There was a shift to from the roots of memory to the roots, as journeys of memory. And this also raises the question of what happens then to place. Is place then out of the picture in that sense? And it was, as such, this paradigm posed a range of questions also about the located nature of diverse processes, acts, and events of memory and forgetting. And for example, when we talk about migration, and then deportations is also forced kind of, or dislocation or migration, then migration scholars have emphasized that this forced dislocation of migration, that it takes place and it's important to look at how or explore how movements of people across physical, political, and internal and cultural boundaries shape identities that are linked to geographical space. Okay, I'll try to move on because otherwise I won't be finished. But as far as deportations are concerned, then behind every deportation story, there is a complex history of dislocation, as well as the history of travel of memory, the core points of which do not only concern the actual movement, but also the possibilities of how memory can be preserved and how it can be mediated. And even the stories that emerge in the normative frameworks of national remembrance, these individual memories of deportation experience, have undergone long processes of travel, and in some format, they also have a prior existence before assuming the shape of a life narrative. And often these narratives, they transcend the frame of reference of national remembrance. And this kind of, how to say, direction of research, this is not, how to say, in line in a way with the mainstream of how deportation experience has been researched in the Baltic states, although, you know, this kind of research frame is also always expanding, but this is not the regular way to do it. So I have gone a bit against the grain by doing it. But when I'm kind of moving on with, you know, this Uno Mell story, that this documentary that was made in 2011, it highlights the process of movement of memory already in the title. That it is called On the Journey to One Grave Out of 4036. So this one grave, it is Uno Mell's mother's grave. And it features the journey to this one deportation site on the coast of the Basyugan River in the Kargasok area in Siberia, and it was taken about 70 years after the date of the first mass deportations on June 14, 1941. And in this documentary, you can, there's a like a footing from this documentary. The camera follows the movements of the film crew and the protagonist of the film, who is this Uno Mell. And the aim is to find his mother's grave. Okay. Let me see. So what is important here is that the film makes visible the deportation location as a particular site of memory that can be referred to as lieu d'oubli, or site of oblivion. That is a concept used by Nancy Wu to refer to sites of memories that are denied public expression or recognition, that public memory has expressly avoided because of the disturbing affect that their invocation is still capable of arousing. And kind of within this direction, a scholar of Russian background, Maria Tumarkin, who now I believe she lives in Australia, she has kind of coined the term traumascapes. So I think that is also kind of would fit into this kind of frame. But the narrative of the film unfolds by mediating the life stories of different Estonian men and women who were deported as children and whose family members died of hunger in the deportation location, usually within a year from deportation, and they were then sent to an orphanage in Aipolova. And this is how Uno Mell renders his deportation experience at the beginning of the documentary. When in 1941 we were taken to Siberia, I was with my mother and 6-year-old sister. We ended up in the village of Kamenovo, where mother died of hunger on July 15th, and my sister died after 5 days. Then I ended up in the orphanage, and because of that survived. And in the film you can see this is a footing from the documentary, but also, as I said, Uno Mell is a amateur filmmaker. So when he went to Siberia with crew, he also made his own film, and he gave me, when I visited him, he gave me all these like his own, you know, films, and also the raw material for the film. And also when he first went back there in 1984, which is really amazing that he could go to this place at that time during the Soviet time. And you know, I have all his material, and I'm just kind of making sense all of it and working it through. So here there's just this one footing from the film. And there are many others. But let me see if I can very quickly show you, change screens and show a little bit the film that he made when he went back there in 84. Oh, look, okay, no, I think it's technically too complicated, so I just continue, yeah. Okay, but here in this documentary, you can see that like he wanders around in the midst of the barely discernible remains of the orphanage, and he is visibly moved by revisiting the site of a traumatic past that, as the film makes clear, he can share with the film crew to a limited extent. And it's also interesting to compare, you know, what the film crew, what they filmed and what Uno Mell himself filmed and what he photographed, to compare these different different images, and also that what was filmed and what was photographed. But he's also, you can see that he's also confused and disturbed by the real life inaccessibility of this important site of memory for him, of its falling into oblivion and being capable of rendered intelligible only schematically. And this experience, his experience, cannot be fitted seamlessly into the framework of national remembrance and successful survival of the Soviet regime. The presentation of these lives makes visible how memory is scattered in time and in space, and the multiple residues of painful past of the people involved that can be honored and commemorated but never fully accessed, and therefore also comprehended by the others. And it also changes the ways in which this experience changes the notion of national community, and it testifies to Swedish researchers John Sundholm's claim about the relevance of research into transnational memory that, according to him, provides a possibility to recognize these small-scale trajectories and memory practices beyond the framework of the nation. I think I do not really have time to continue very extensively with my second example, but here you can see, and just to quickly explain, when Uno's mother died, he said that he didn't know what to do, and then he wanted to make some record of it. So he took, you know, what for him, you know, seemed like the best material, and he made a small memorial book. And in this book, he kind of wrote down how his mother died, and then a few days later how his sister died, and then he kept these records. And it was also forbidden in Siberia to keep this record, but somehow he was able to take them with him when he was taken to the orphanage, and then take those records to Estonia. And in Estonia, he told me that he hid them, he buried them, because it was dangerous to have those records. And then later he could take them out. And so he has preserved those records to this day. And when I visited him, I asked him that why did you, because he was a child, he was a boy when he witnessed, why did you write this down, and or when did you start writing things down? And he said, I think I did it already on the train, because for me it was first, I felt that it was a journey, you know, like when you're an explorer, that I had read these explorers' diaries or stories about them, you know, as a boy. But also he said that for me, it was a way to make sense of it. And for him, you know, this making sense, it always included, you know, this, not just, you know, writing, but, you know, he made this little book with his own hands, and this helped him to cope with the experience. And when he later he started filming, he is an amateur filmmaker. He has, I don't know how hundreds of hours of amateur films that he has made of his family. So this was also a way of coping with this experience. But here is a short extract from his life story, where he writes about his first visit back to Siberia, to his mother's grave. He said, he writes here that he wanted to go back, but it was also difficult, so he kept postponing it. But when he finally went there, he had his film camera with him, and then he comments, it's just that he says, although I had filmed with my camera for years, the shots of Kamenema were of poor quality. When filming, I changed angles unnecessarily quickly. So he was a very, technically really talented, and he made his career. He was he worked in communication as a communications engineer without any proper education, also for the Soviet aviation company Aeroflot, and so his way of expressing his emotions, this experience of going back to his mother's grave, is commenting, kind of criticizing his poor ability to properly film it. Yeah. Okay. So I'll end here, and it is, as I said, that it is very fragmented and fractured. There is no proper unity, and I'm very sorry for it. So, but thank you very much.
Well, thank you very, very much, Lena. And it's funny that you say, and maybe Gun, if you want to call you there now, okay. So maybe if you want to stop sharing, got it, okay. And it's funny, obviously, whenever we're talking about trauma, we are talking about fragmentation, and we are talking about things that are left, incomplete, things that cannot be told, and we're talking about the spaces and the holes. And it's quite interesting that both of you in your papers were talking about ideas of sense making, what that means, making sense, and in particular making meaning, which is of course the work of life narratives, right? Is to make some kind of meaning of prior experience by putting it together with a beginning, a middle, and an end, even where that doesn't exist. That is our natural temptation as human beings. But I'll start off just with one starter question for each of you. And if people would like to put questions in the chat, please do. Or of course, you can raise your hand as well, and I'll try to come around to you. So to begin with, I was thinking, I've often been interested in your concentration on ideas of forgetting, because obviously, we're working in a world where everyone's talking about memory and trauma and memory, and thinking about forgetting. But I thought it was fascinating the way you linked together sort of demented memory and post memory with traumatic memory, and that all of these forms of let's say memory disruption, how they are all fragmented, that we see all of them out of context, that they kind of flare up and then disappear, that they're linked to secrets, whether cultural secrets or familial secrets or historical secrets. And I just wondered if you might say something about that. In particular, you said something about culture itself being related to forgetting and memory. So I just wondered if you might say a little bit more about those distinct forms of forgetting that you were talking about.
Yeah, I mean, there are. I think it is fascinating to try to understand forgetting, because I think it is a fascinating phenomenon, and I think we often overlook it because, of course, we are trying to sort of hold on to these memories and try to sort of bring them back, and we're trying to put them together to make sense, as you say, and so on. But I think it is very interesting to see in these type of memoirs that are on a parent's dementia, which is a common theme, of course. It is fascinating to see the same tropes, as you say, as when talking about traumatic memory. Mm-hmm. as you say, it is so fragmented that there is this sense of trying to fill in the gaps. It is very tempting to try to fill in the gaps. So you can have a whole story, but then also be thwarted all the time, because either the story doesn't make sense, it doesn't have a nice solution to it, or the gaps just can't be filled. So you see, you see the writer trying to come to terms with this, and of course some just that they fill in the gaps and they make these lovely narratives, but some writers of course keep pointing to these holes in the story, the forgotten.
Mm-hmm.
But of course we can think about forgetting in many terms, also of course in sort of cultural forgetting, where cultures do not want to remember certain events, which of course we know very well from different regimes and different in different nations and so on. So there is also this degree of silencing certain voices, that with continued silences, of course, you induce forgetting, because their stories aren't heard, their memories aren't preserved, and so on. So I think that's why I'm so fascinated by forgetting. There's so many ways in which to view both private memory and memories of cultural memory and memories of nation through that.
Because I know that one of your areas of interest is around not only Iceland, but Ireland. And a few years ago, I was at a book festival, and we were talking to, and I can't remember the name of the group now, but there was the women's group in Ireland that was like the group of mothers that helped to form the Good Friday Agreement, and were and the woman who was the head of that group was talking, and she was saying that that there would never have been peace in Northern Ireland if it had not been for forgetting. That we talk all the time about memory and how we have to remember, but that how a huge part of culture is moving forward is around forgetting, or at least culturally forgetting, even if obviously no individual who has been harmed will forget. But that as a culture, you choose to forget this wrong or that wrong in order for your culture to move forward, or something like that.
Yeah, and that is a very interesting thing, because that it is of course something that ties into sort of in like Truth and Reconciliation, South Africa and so on, and of course the Pact of Forgetting in Spain after the death of Franco and so on, where it is obvious that if you never talk about these things, if they're always left unspoken, they will just continue to sort of work their way underneath and to sort of fester, if you like. So the way in which societies have coped with this is very interesting to look at. As I say, either these kind of willful forgetting or silencing, or first you have to talk about things. First you have to acknowledge that somebody was hurt, and you have to acknowledge who did the hurting and so on. So I think it's a fascinating discussion.
Thank you.
If I think of, kind of from the perspective of the topics that I have been focusing on my research, then of course, as I said, that during the period of regaining of independence, there was this need to talk about, things that had been silenced by the Soviet regime, to have talk about this, suffering. But at the same time, as I said, it was kind of there were never rules that you need to you can only talk kind of in the key of survival, but this was as if an unwritten rule that people followed, and there was this, they never talked about harsher sides of experience. And then a lot later these discussions of trauma have entered kind of Estonian public debates about memory and forgetting. And so a good friend of mine, Imbi Paju, made a documentary in 2006 that is titled Memories Denied, and she says that these memories, that they have been memories of pain and suffering, they have been denied to people, and it's important to bring those out and to discuss them, and then we can put them at rest and move forward. But for me it was really like a life-changing experience to visit Uno Mell this February, because like he what I kind of saw what he had been doing all his life, that he was remembering so intensely and so acutely in this as little as there was to remember. So he never, got to, really live a life together with his parents, because his father was also, he sent to Gulag and also died, and his sister and his mother. So he never, his family was taken from him. And then he remembered kind of so intensely this, as the little, scraps of memory that he had, and he created some kind of like a memory dome for them. But at the same time, it was for me, it was difficult to understand it all. But I think it was for him this kind of, as best as he could handle this experience, and to live kind of to live a full life, and to kind of go on with his life and to cope with experience, so that it's like, in terms of remembering and forgetting, it is kind of almost remembering in place of the experience that never happened. And so that was, I don't know if it's appropriate. So it was so interesting for me to witness that, when I talked to him and when he showed me all these records. And,
No, absolutely. I think one of the key things that we know about trauma, traumatic experience, trauma memory, is that it comes, a traumatic experience is an experience that is unexpected. It is necessarily something that you did not see coming, and that has no why. Right, there is no real answer to why someone was put in the Gulag in terms of the bigger picture of, what meaning does this have in life. Obviously, there are political reasons for doing so, but there's no human reason. There's no rational reason that a human being could understand for why they would undergo that experience. And so the idea of being able to that what trauma memory then does, because something is offered to us without any meaning, that then we necessarily have to attempt to find that meaning, and that it can become a compulsive search. And it's quite interesting that in both of your papers you're talking about that compulsive search then passing on to the people in the next generation, whether within a family, as in this the memoirs you were talking about, or within the material itself, Lena, that you were looking at. And I want to ask you too, Lena, something about, I thought it was very interesting what you were talking about, this whole idea of the haunted materialities, both that that you are haunted, or that, we are haunted, culture is haunted by these materials which talk of traumatic past histories, but also that the materials themselves are in some way haunted or tainted by their association with that past, or by their the way in which they signify the past. But then also you talked about the roots, meaning the travel over time of the stories and that material. And I thought, I wonder if you might just say something about within Estonian culture, how these materials have helped, the effect that these materials may have had on that storytelling. Does that make sense? The way in which your culture talks about the experience of the Gulag and the deportations.
Well, as I said, that this is not kind of, how to say, the kind of official picture has not really looked at deportation experience like this. So it has always has always been kind of surprising for me to perceive that how tightly it is, related to national memory, while, it is of places far away, also of meeting people who are not of Estonian descent, people who were deported or sent to Gulag. They, of course, you couldn't, just stick to your nationality or even the Baltic people together. You met all kinds of people, and these encounters, they saved, people's lives. So that the most encounters really that people talk about in their stories, they are not, of evil, of bad people, of bad things that were done to them. They like to mention rather, people who helped them survive, and the kindness of local people who gave them food and so on and so on. So that they are of, I think they are very big importance, but they have not been, I think, so prevalent in this deportation experience stories, that somehow this, how to say, the way it has been summed up, you know, in public debates, it is kind of very uniform kind of memory that is like that. It was a harsh experience, but we survived. We came back to Estonia, and then our nation survived, and we, because of that, in the end, we became independent again, and it's all good. Of course, this is a hugely simplified, you know, this formula that I give to you, but it has been a little like this. So these things have not been so kind of in clear view, but at the same time, for example, my kind of when I got acquainted with all these, you know, Hunomel's materials, then I saw also with my own eyes how this has been so important for him, that he, you know, that he himself, he says in his life story that it was, you know, for years and for years I thought that I need to go back. I need to go back to Siberia. I need to find my mother's grave. I need to go back to this place where this orphanage once was, where I lived. So I think it's a very clear, you know, proof of, you know, that this memory, it, you know, travels, and that it has these materialities that are not here in Estonia. Yeah.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the key things that we see again and again with life storytelling is that it is often a challenge to dominant narratives, where you know, and sometimes that's a gendered challenge when we start to hear, as you were talking about, the number of women's voices that begin to be heard during this singing revolution. As you were talking about, let's see, there's a question in the chat. Do either of you have any thoughts on resistance to remembering in terms of work you've done? Many families, communities, societies, states have secrets which are fiercely guarded, and there can be a threat associated with remembering. Yeah, and I think it'd be interesting to maybe to hear from each of you on that topic.
Shall I start then? Yes. Yeah. Yes, you can see this this resistance. You can see this, of course, within a single family, of course, where there's a troubled past. There's a secret that the family doesn't want revealed, and we know texts like that explored hidden sides to families which have, you know, caused a rupture in the family and so on. And of course, you can see this in societies as well, this resistance to remembering. And there, of course, in particular, where there have been, you know, traumatic events, not least civil wars, which often cause this great resistance to remembering, because you don't want to fall back into the same fights as you had earlier. And of course, there's you can see that there's, at the millennium, when I was talking about the millennial memory boom, this was of course a very strong movement. I mean, all over, where there was this call for, let's talk about the past, and let's not listen to the voices that are resisting these memories anymore. So there's quite a lot of that, and I think it is one of the things that make memory studies important, is the sort of understanding of the forces behind cultural memory and national memory, state memory, and so on. That's something that memory studies can really address. Mm-hmm. And of course, we have memory activism. We have memory activists who are sort of unearthing events that the state doesn't want unearthed, and so on. So there's plenty of there to work on.
Mm. Thank you.
When I look at this question from kind of the material I work with, then I'm just thinking that, is it resistance to remembering, or this is what I often wonder, or is it resistance, you know, or recollecting? Like, for example, people who have not, you know, told their life stories or written their life stories. It's not because they don't remember, but they feel that their stories do not fit the frame, or they tell their story in a certain way, and it's not the way they remember it, but it's the way they recollect it, you know, for, you know, to suit the frame. My interest in in these deportation stories, it goes back to my kind of family. My grandmother's best friend she wasn't deported as women Muslims. She was part of the also resistance movement, and she was in the Gulag for 25 years almost. And she never, I remember her from my childhood when she sometimes visited my grandparents, but she was not allowed to live in Estonia. So she secretly came to Estonia and she had a gangrene. So she was allowed to be treated in the hospital in Tartu. And I remember, basically I remember when we went to visit her in the hospital, yet another part of her legs or feet had been amputated. And she never talked about her life, really. She never told her life story. I have asked my mother. My mother is her, what you say, like she was my mother's godmother, yeah. And I asked my mother also whether, what do you know about her? Did she tell her, the story how she was in the Gulag? And there are just small snippets, but she never told her story. And I think this is what somehow remained with me. And I started looking for answers when I grew up and became a scholar. And those kinds of answers, I thought that I do a little bit of research, I find all the answers, but I didn't. And of course, it is largely also gender that it is strange, but women don't talk a lot about gendered experience. Definitely they don't talk about this kind of gendered experience that could be a taboo subject. I've done also some research into sexual violence, how did if it occurred and how was it reflected on. It is almost non-existent. But also they don't mention so much, they don't talk about going through the deportation as women. And this is also like kind of for the sake of the national memory, let's not, mediate our life story in a very gendered way, like we are all Estonians or we are all Baltics, not necessarily men and women. And even, on this really domestic or like simple level, it is absent. And I think also Marianne Hirsch has written about similar things where Holocaust memory is concerned, that gendered experience seemed as if inappropriate to bring forward, once we have a huge, traumatic event like Holocaust, that it doesn't matter, and it matters. And then, Ruth Kluger has written how kind of acutely it really matters and how it has been overlooked. So it is not, just with the Stalinist repressions. It has been discussed also in other contexts. Yeah.
Thank you. Marina, I think you have a question?
Yes, I do. Thank you. Thank you both for really, really interesting talks. It's really actually, it's a question for you both, but Gunther and I was thinking about, particularly about the Holocaust. I'm reading, I've read actually a book by Ava Hoffman. I don't know if you know the work, After Such Knowledge. It's an incredible piece, but she talks about, so she is the daughter of parents who lived through the Holocaust, and she talks about the second generation being the guardians of these stories and having this huge burden of having to sort of carry on the stories, carrying on the memory. But then she also says, and I think this is really interesting, is that this next generation is now able to ask questions, and this point, Meg, you were making about, finding meaning. It makes me think of Viktor Frankl as well, Man's Search for Meaning. It's the subsequent generations are now able to look back and to try and make sense of it all, which that first generation wasn't able to. Mm. So it was really just something I was thinking about. Mm.
Yeah, and I think that is why you see so many of them, of writers of that generation, writing, traveling, researching, just trying to find a thread, something to hold on to, and some way in which to represent the stories of their parents, while also there's also a sense in some of these works that it isn't their story to tell, mm-hmm. that they are
some way or another, they are invading their parents' privacy, or you know, they're talking about things that they perhaps never wanted to talk about. So there's also that tension that is going on in many of these works, and there's also this the sort of the uncertainty of how of survival, which can be fraught with guilt and all kinds of sort of stories that you don't necessarily want to preserve or tell, or that are difficult. Mm-hmm. And I think both Eva Hoffmann and Lisa Appignanesi talk about this. I mean, Appignanesi's mother, she always presented her story of survival as a heroic story. She was very much the hero of all of her stories, and she never talked about the dark side of these things, but was always the hero who saved the family. So there's so many interesting things that are happening between the generations, and yeah, there are all kinds of tensions with memory and representation there.
Yeah. Well, in terms of this, this post-memory, and of course, Eva Hoffmann is one of those, people who have, introduced the term post-memory together with Marianne Hirsch and Leo Spitzer. And there's also this kind of work, that I can bring examples from Baltic context, that where daughters have kind of made films like Imbi Baju's Memories Denied is about her mother and her mother's twin sister being, sent to the Gulag as young girls, and kind of trying to tell their story, also the story of possible, sexual violence. And then also that was quite on bestseller list in US. Agathe Nesaula wrote Woman in Amber about her mother and her when she was a young girl, escaping, from Latvia, Germany, and then being caught in the passing of the front and witnessing, this wave of raping, and then this question of, what happened to her mother. So they have tried to tell those different stories, and there's always, this what you also said, that what can we know and what is appropriate to tell, or how far can you dig. And I have, Imbi Baju is a close friend of me, and she has told me, a lot, that there's things that she knows but never can share with anyone, and, places where she stops and feels she cannot go on. But there's also in one of the deportation stories that was rather recently donated to the archive. It's a very, very long story, hundreds of pages long, beautifully written. But the author questions the ability of younger generations to understand her story. She says that even the way we use language, that, for example, during the time of regaining independence, our first president, Lennart Meri, says, if needed, we will eat potato peels. He said in Siberia, this was a luxury, this was a delicatessen. We didn't have even those. So, and then people say that you were only given 300 grams of bread a day. I don't want to eat that much bread even, so what's the big deal? And she says, if this is, how people perceive the world now, I cannot share my experience. They won't understand it. So it's kind of lost. I'm writing it down, but with very little hope of really anyone really perceiving it, because, times have moved on and there's no place for memories like this. So there's that too.
I think there's a lot of questions, both, ethical questions, but also, of interest, to writers and historians and life narrative scholars around, what does it mean? And I know, Lina, you've written a lot about this too, about the context in which narratives, traumatic narratives are produced. And, what does it mean if you ask a Holocaust survivor to come to your school and talk to your students about the Holocaust, that what kind of a setting, that what we're telling that person is, we only want to hear that part of your story, right? We don't want to hear the whole story of your life. All we want to hear about is that one portion of your story. And actually the Steven Spielberg Foundation has put together, all these films with Holocaust survivors, and they all follow the same format, where the person talks 30% of their video is about their life before and after their experience, and the other 70% of the videotape is all about the Holocaust, as if that's even though obviously this person has lived another 60, 70, 80 years beyond that moment, that's not what we want to hear about. That's not the important thing. So, and that's just one kind of context in which testimony like that is shared, and so that I guess just thinking also about the audience that's receiving those stories. That's what's so interesting to me, Lena, about the materiality that you're talking about, as a way, as a non-verbal way of communicating that history and that experience, that maybe goes beyond that kind of personal ethical border to some degree, or it takes a different route to communicate, or something like that. Should I see? Do we have any other questions?
I just want to briefly address it. I have thought about it a lot in my research, and I have tried to, how to say, do justice to the life stories that I work with. And for example, exactly what you said, that in Estonia, we have this tradition, we don't ask people, just talk about your deportation story, but simply write your life story. And deportation experience can take up most of it, or it can be, for example, Una Mell has written a long life story, and deportation experience is about maybe 30% or 20%. And then when, for example, when I'm writing an article about all his materials, I need to, say that, his life story, he tells about other things. He also tells how he, built up his life on his own when he came back. And so that this needs to be acknowledged as a researcher also, because how you usually do, you pick this, the way I did. I had just one little snippet of his life story on the screen for you, and it was about the specific aspect of the deportation, basically too, when he described how he witnessed his mother's death, and then about going back to his, their grave. And this is not his life story, and I think that it needs to be, how to say, proportionally correctly represented in research also. Yeah. Yes, so it's something I have thought about quite a bit.
Well, thank you both so much. Maria Mencia, who's one of our colleagues, has put in the chat a link to her project, which is about personal and collective storytelling and memory. So she's just put that if anyone wants to have a look at that. And I should just finish by saying thank you both so much. It was absolutely fascinating. I'm very, very grateful to both of you for sharing. And, in our brave new world, post-COVID, this is much easier to facilitate such a meeting from people from such far-flung places. So thank you so much. And I'll send you a link to the recording when it's done. So thank you very, very much. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you
for having us.
It's really nice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.
So I just wanted to, I wanted to say once more that I'm really it's such a pity that it went like this with the project, that you put in so much of time.
No, it wasn't that. No. And actually, I was annoyed because when I talked to the here, let me just stop the recording for a second.
Oh, okay. Yes, sorry. Oh my God.
I'm sure I'll get in trouble one day. Okay, stop recording.
Hopefully.